Welcome, welcome, welcome. We hope that you've been enjoying a fantastic conference today and hope that you're excited for the next one coming up. I'm Dr. Deborah Dupree, and with me right now is Lou Chang, and we're happy to invite you here on behalf of the American Arbitration Association. Our esteemed moderator and leader, Harold Pullman, will be joining us a little bit later. But today, we're going to take you into some insights on impasse, those emotional triggers and reactions that get so flared up when people are in conflict. So we're going to spend the next 40 minutes taking you through some very interesting and insightful viewpoints about managing impasse. And when we come back, we'll be open to your questions and answers, and I'll share with you a couple of tips and techniques that will help you move through those more difficult, emotional, intense moments. Let's take it away.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are now into our final module for the first module on insights on impasse. And before we really do the deeper dive into specific emotional interventions, we do want to take another look or conclude our discussions on emotional triggers and reactions. And before we even get there, let me go back to Lou, if I could. Lou, you said some things that were very interesting before our break, some concluding thoughts on impasse. And there are a couple of things in particular that you said can also be some paths that actually reinforce impasse, and we need to be aware of them. Go back to that for us, if you would.
I wanted to add that in addition to the usual dimensions, factual conflicts, relational conflicts, procedural conflicts, there's also tactical conflicts. People, by their negotiation strategies, can work their way into impasses because of the nature of the negotiation style or tactic. And that sometimes, and I think we've been talking about it indirectly a lot, there are psychological, where it's important enough a dimension that it needs to be consciously and specifically addressed. But the point is that impasses can occur in any of these dimensions or because of what's being done in any of these dimensions. It gives us insight as to how to approach them, and we then are able to apply an array of tools to address them, different tools for different situations. And here's where we as mediators can bring and exercise our judgment and inspiration and bring art to what we do.
Absolutely. Let me actually build on something you just said, Lou. You said, depending on negotiation style is another indicator. People can work their way into impasse. And, if you adopt the view we shared with you earlier, colleagues, which is that parties come to mediation at a state of impasse, then this negotiation style that worked them into impasse occurred before mediation. Because had that not been the case, they wouldn't need a mediator. So then if, as they say, Dr. Dupree, if we keep doing the same old things, expecting different outcomes, we only fool ourselves. So what's the call of the day? Maybe we should do some things differently. We should maybe refine our negotiation style. More on that later. Let's take a look some more at some common triggers, Dr. Dupree, of emotional flare-ups. Now, we saw a good visual or demonstration of that, but in your experience as a clinician, okay, behavioral scientist, what's really, really noteworthy for us as practicing mediators here?
Well, it goes back to some of the things we've said in our previous components, as far as Lou made reference to them, I made reference to them, in terms of the need for security, the need for inclusion, connection, a sense of trust. And so what we now know, again, science and research, that if we are aware of some key things, we can use these knowledge of these things to then frame our thinking differently to what's going on. And so I present this to you. I'd written an article about a year or so ago and did a lot of research into, what's the science behind that? What are some of the common indicators that come up for people? And so what this does is that it demonstrates 10 common triggers that are behind the emotional reaction that people have. And, these are all, the sort of the negative side of it, because again, they're the triggers. But our job then would be to reframe them into positive. So, for example, unjust treatment, at least in my experience in mediation, what I do, people can feel very strongly about. I've been wronged. I didn't get my fair shake, something like that. Or just even the video we saw, challenge beliefs. People spoke up and then they were immediately attacked for what they said. And I see this a lot in my workplace mediations where, meetings are very important. We talked about that earlier. And yet teams coming in, people coming into a team meeting, for example, unless there's some rules, some protocol set up for how that meeting's going to go and how to diffuse it by the meeting leader, then people can feel that, learn to feel not to speak up. They're afraid to say what they have because they're afraid of being torn down or shut down. And we see that a lot in many different settings. I certainly have seen it in mediations as well. And we want to keep people engaged. And so that's where the mediator really does need a multidimensional perspective of these things, have different tools in their toolbox. Lou said a few characteristics, but I want to add to that, a flexibility and agility to shift, seeing that what they're doing is not working well. And I like to reframe it, what's working, what's not working so well. And having the resilience to be able to shift, to try some different tactics, but it starts off by having enough tactics too. Going back to the list here, exclusion is a huge thing, or being ignored. And that is particularly true for a certain communication style. We all can probably identify, experiences from our past where we've been criticized, maybe by a parent or a sibling, or maybe at work, and so that can tend to again trigger that physiological and emotional limbic response that again clouds our ability to get back to the prefrontal cortex. And then control or loss of independence. Loss of independence particularly comes true as we talk about mediation in the elderly or aging area. So what I like to do around these, and I want to point out this visual here, is that this is a good example of how if we get caught up in the middle of the brain, you can see where it says thalamus and amygdala, and the black circle actually loops back around and we stay stuck there. And unless we can slow down and recognize, have that self-awareness, both as a mediator, but also as a participant, we circumvent the neurological pathways up into the prefrontal cortex. And so understanding a basic science, understanding some of the common responses that come up to triggers, what's going on for the person. Again, mindfulness being that getting better at sensing where others are coming from. These 10 can be used as a framework for what people are experiencing around whatever the factual issue is. So just one tool that can be used there. And when we get to our plenary, I'm going to actually take our participants through an activity so they can quickly see how what we experience in our brain from a positive experience to a negative experience, and then back to a positive. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the plenary, where we have a chance to really explore what's happening in our own brains, as well as what could be happening in the brains of our participants.
And Dr. Dupree, that is the experiential practicum number 1, where we will be able to take these for a test drive, as you say, in a plenary setting. And of course, we can have all of our colleagues weigh in with their thoughts, questions, concerns, etc. So that's going to be a fun time. Please don't miss it. A Saturday experiential practicum. In looking at this mosaic right here, Dr. Dupree, and relating it back to the business meeting where we saw some clear emotional flare-ups, it would seem to me, and of course I can't do a professional diagnosis as you could, but it would seem to me like you got 3 real huge drivers here for the president of that board's behavior and his escalated flare-up. I dare say disapproval and criticism, which he was getting that from all quarters from his colleagues, loss of control of the meeting, and underlying all of that might have been a profound sense of insecurity. What say you?
I would definitely say those things were going on, and perhaps even being challenged in his beliefs. I think adding that one to what you just said, is very key. And again, if we can understand what's going on with that, then we can take steps to redirect.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, part of this triaging concept. Lou, in your world of commercial and construction, mediations, and you've done an awful lot in the employment space and labor. What jumps out at you here? In other words, if you had to say, boy, I'll tell you, if there are one or two common denominators that I see as drivers of emotional flare-ups in the kinds of mediations I do, which is very typically parties represented by counsel, et cetera, what would you say those might be?
Parties present in conflict with a certain strategy, a certain persona. They take stances and the like. It may reflect the fears that they are feeling of being rejected or devalued, not listened to, or being criticized, and the like. But they don't tell us that, right?
Yeah.
That's not something that we're told about. We have to have ways
Yes.
we can observe, and we can try to make some conclusions from our observation. But we also can ask questions. And here's a point that we should not forget to ask human questions, general questions, conversational in tone and aspect that seem unrelated to the conflict, but give the party an open-ended opportunity to tell us more about what they're fearing, what they're concerned about. And that will give us hopefully better insight as to exactly what is happening. What's behind the insecurity, what's the consequence of the challenged belief, and the like. So it just helps us in this triaging process as we decide, which tool, which strategy might be useful here. Harold, I wonder, do we want to expand upon the 3 Bs by Dr. Dupree?
The 3, please go right ahead, Dr. Dupree.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for asking that, Lou. The 3 Bs is actually a technique that I have applied for many years in my work with people in emotional moments, particularly for those who want to learn to better self-manage, that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And so, again, it starts with self-awareness in terms of what's going on for me right now. How am I triggered, and being in the moment to just recognize it, that we're in a triggered state. And if I act on that trigger, then I may say and do things that could be hurtful, harmful, and damaging. And so we want to refrain from doing that, because that's what we saw in that board meeting. A lot of hurtful, harmful, and damaging things were done very publicly. And so then we want to actually employ something we all already do: breathe. It's just changing the way we breathe in order to make it more effective for us. And so shifting to, when you feel triggered, then go ahead and take 3 or 4 deep breaths, because when you take deep breaths, you're expanding your lungs, you're expanding your abdomen, you're slowing down your heart rate, and you're also slowing down the brainwave activity. And then sometimes people want to practice that, 2 or 3 sets of 3 or 4 deep breaths to get to feel that lowering. And that's what that activity we'll talk about when we experience it. And then you want to be able to visualize, break free from that moment. How do I want to show up on the other side? How do I want to present myself in the aftermath of this triggered moment? Because when we visualize, we move ourselves out of the limbic brain, where we've been dancing and swimming in all this emotionality, up to the prefrontal cortex. So just that very simple thing is the active visualization will take us to a different part of our brain, literally.
Yes. And, what are we talking about, colleagues? We are talking about emotional triggers and reactions. That's the general overlay here. And to build on something that Lou shared, is that, parties come to mediation with different agendas. They come to mediation with different levels of communication ability. And they may or may not just come right out and be able to identify, well, I'm feeling helpless. Or, really what's driving, at least where I am in this is that I'm pretty insecure. They may not. They may feel as though, no, that's a showing of weakness. We have to, and this is for our lawyer colleagues here, especially, as litigators, okay, how important the inference is. The logical conclusion based upon other facts. We have to be able to ask the right questions, as Lou mentioned, as Deborah said, and assess the situation and sometimes infer what really the drivers are. The power of the inference is as huge in mediation, in my judgment, if not more so than it is in litigation and arbitration. The ability to infer information based upon other information that we get. With that, let's move ahead. I'm coming back to you again, Dr. Dupree, on understanding the role of emotions when parties are at impasse. In particular, Dr. Dupree, this negative emotion called anger, so now these amygdala are on overdrive, and as the conflict escalates, really, what are some foreseeable, predictable outcomes unless we know how to assess and intervene quickly?
Again, by taking a look at these common triggers, I have another strategy we'll be introducing at the practicum called the beach and the FIVMs. Again, a way of structuring our listening. And so one of the things I frequently say, and we've heard this a lot over our shift to virtual dispute resolution strategies too, is that people oftentimes say they can't read body language as effectively. And yet, if you look at this visual on the slide here, I have another activity too, where I take participants through what does this facial expression mean? And it's amazing how universal the response is in terms of, what does this facial expression mean? And so the one thing we do have access totally to, whether it's in person or virtually, is our facial expressions. And too often people will not comment on what they see and offer some insight as far as what's going on for you, and they're waiting for people to say things. And so unless we, again, this multidimensional approach in persona and perspective towards people already coming into conflict and impasse to some degree, and that we can redirect by paying attention to the behaviors, the words being used. And when we show that we're paying attention, people feel that, they feel that they're being heard. And so, before, and I can see where in my early days of mediation too, we were much more focused on the process, the strategy, and the outcomes of reaching an agreement. However, as we've learned and demonstrated through the studies that we have talked about so far, and also the evolution of neuroscience, that some of these other non-factual elements of human behavior are critically important in helping people move through and learning to diffuse or redirect some of those emotional expressions. And so this is where we're growing so much in our role as mediators, by taking a look at the different factors that do influence the process as well as the outcome. And then, of course, preserving the integrity of the humans involved.
Excellent. And you know what, the colleagues, ADR colleagues, just to give you a little bit of a mini synopsis right here, look at how far we've come. Our focus before learning more about the behavioral aspects of what's at play in mediation was on strategy and tactics. See all this as a transactional deal. Lou spoke to that a little while ago. And our terminal objective, we tend to think, has to be the settlement outcome. But now, in light of all the studies and hopefully some enlightenment we're getting, through our time together here, we realize that emotions really do matter. And the strategic management of emotions is important to the role of managing anxiety and hopefully having a productive conversation and mediation that is calculated to increase the probability of a satisfying experience and a good outcome of the parties making full recognition of self-determination. Lou, I'd like to now transition to some common distortions in thinking that can occur as a function of the emotions. Our next visual will really typify this. Labeling, people call things and call people names and things, and we have overgeneralization that happens a lot, polarized thinking, all or nothing thinking, this black or white is either all one way or the other way, my way or the highway. But, you actually really enlightened me on this thing called futurizing and historizing in terms of thinking distortions. Tell us more about that, if you would.
I look at futurizing as a strategy and possible strategy to use, and it's a judgment thing as to when it's appropriate to futurize. Let me tell you a story of having personally gone to mediation with my sister, who was opposing me in an action to appoint myself as a guardian for my mom, who was showing the effects of dementia and the like. And it was stunning to me that my sister would oppose me, because it was an eminently proper thing to do, I thought. But we had to mediate, and I resisted mediation, because I thought I was right, and she was just being petty. But good counsel and the judge advised me, you should mediate this. And so we were in front of a mediator, a former family court judge. And, we were talking, and there's a lot of history in these family disputes, as you know. And my sister was going into what happened in 2008 and 2009 and what I did or didn't do. And the judge, the mediators, said, I don't care what happened in 2009. What we need to decide is what has to be done for your mom today. And that was a stark pivot to the future. But it was correct. It was right. We could talk about the history for hours, if not days, and the like. But what we really needed to talk about was the future. And so there's a question of timing on that. When is it palatable? When will it be acceptable to the parties to move them from an emotional state of fight to looking at the future? So it's a very powerful and strategic thing to do.
Yeah.
And highly successful. I later asked that judge about her strategy, because I was wanting to study different strategies addressing impasse. And she said she's very comfortable with that. As a family court judge, she has heard those stories hundreds of times and recognized that it was not productive and stuff. So she just implements that, uses that all the time. And it works for her. And it worked in that instance.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a saying that my good colleague, Neil Carmichael, with whom I've done many, many mediation trainings through the years, give attribution to him. He actually uses it, and I have now borrowed it for my own use. And it's very simply this. You say to parties, what's happened in the past is not nearly as important as the decisions we make today. And that can have a very sobering effect. Yeah, Lou?
Can I add something? When we learn from the science and the neurological information that we've been given, that people, when they're caught in this emotional hijack,
Mhm.
And all these hormones are in their systems. It takes 18 minutes, 3 or 4 hours, 1 to 3 days. It cautions us as mediators that we have a responsibility when we try to manage these tensions to consider the appropriateness, the ripeness, the propriety of pushing parties to resolution, and that we're responsible to provide a safe space as well as a fair process.
Yeah.
So when we are seeing this kind of emotional capture, maybe we need to hold back, take time, and all breathe until we can get to an appropriate point of ripeness for the parties to make good decisions for their conflicts.
Absolutely. Deborah, if you would quickly focus on the right column here, items 7 through 12. Anything there in terms of thinking distortions that are certainly derivative of perhaps negative emotions brought into mediation that we as mediators should take note of?
Yes, thank you for that opportunity, because there are some that are, we've got a lot here, but there are some I think that we will most likely agree that tend to show up more frequently than others. But, we naturally have parties who are, always the glass half empty versus the glass half full. They're always looking for the negative and are really challenged to look at the positive. And that can come from a whole lot of, past history that clouds their current thinking. And again, keeps them in that sort of, I'm going to say not constant, but high state of cortisol operating. Okay. They're always looking at the negative side. Jumping to conclusions is another thing that, we all make assumptions. It's important to interpret what's going on. The problem with assumptions, though, is when we act on them without clarifying or validating. And so that's where jumping to conclusions, and we have to redirect that and say, well, what's the reality, or what's the facts behind that statement you just made? And well, that's just what I think is happening. Okay, well then let's unpack where we can go with that. And we've already talked about emotional reasoning. And then number 11, I see this come up a lot, where we, some people make the problem bigger than what it is. And I've come to rename that to catastrophizing. And the worst is going to come. Yeah. And then some people naturally take things very personally, and that's where we again need to redirect that kind of emotional thinking, and that sort of ties into the emotional reasoning. I like to use I believe this saying comes from Zig Ziglar, fear. And Lou's referenced this before, but fear is really nothing more than false evidence appearing real.
Yes.
And that's where we have to test these assumptions. We have to test, bring it back to the positive, because people are living in a state of fear. And oftentimes it's what they think is going to happen rather than what is happening or could really happen.
Absolutely. And what they might be able to control if they would actually be more positive and optimistic as to outcomes. Lou, let me, something in our preparation I thought was very fascinating is our next visual shows something that you have regarded as kind of false signs of impasse, which we've agreed is really these are the kinds of thinking or attitudes that reinforce impasse. They don't help parties get the breakthrough they may need, so we can then turn our attention to the analytical techniques and more objective measurement of what's going on. Can you kind of summarily give us your take on what's really happening here?
Have you had times, Harold, when in a mediation that resolves, one party or other will tell you on the side, I didn't think that it would be possible for us to resolve this thing? Right. And that happens so often. So I tried to look back at cases then as to why the case appeared to be at an impasse, appeared unresolvable, but yet in mediation was resolved. And
Right.
so I was able to identify these characteristics, or these, I call them flags, that are signs to us as mediators that don't give up yet. This may just be part of the process or part of the strategy that people are taking. So
Yes.
I noted that when they're playing a lot of games, they're highly tactical. They wanna be strategic and do this for this reason and expect this kind of response and the like. High gamesmanship is
Mhm.
a common characteristic of cases that appear to be at an impasse, but not really. The second of the party who wants to always get the last word. Somebody who's afraid of leaving something on the table, so they keep coming back and try to get a little bit more and the like. Sometimes you have institutional pressures. You have a
Yeah.
constituency that you have to be responsive to, a board, a union membership, and you have to fight the good fight. So you may have very good proposals on the table, but if you settle too early, it doesn't look right.
Mhm.
And where people are controlling the flow of information.
Mhm.
A lot of the times we are encouraging parties to be comfortable and free to tell us as much as possible. So we have a more full understanding. But tactically, people come and they want to control information. They don't want to disclose information and the like because of some tactical reason. And where they try to hold you back as mediator. They don't want you to do something or have
Yeah.
something. And again, that's an indicator that they're using you as a tool and not as your full, potential.
Mhm.
Proposals viewed skeptically refers to the there's a term for it where if you make the proposal, it will be rejected because it came from you, and anything
Yeah.
that comes from you is not acceptable. So here, then you have the mediator make the proposal instead of you, instead of the parties. And then also too, there are cases where you've identified options,
Yeah.
and it's clear that the options are better than the alternative,
Yeah.
and yet it's not settling. So that's a sign also that something else is happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, we need to figure that out and figure out ways to respond to that. We could ignore it, we could sunshine it, we could call it to the attention of the person and say, are you doing this because you have to show that you're fighting the good fight?
Yeah.
And sometimes you sunshine it and you use it to inform the other party that the
Right.
reason we're having this impasse is because this party is having to deal with an institutional obligation to fight the good fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we adapt. So we've got to assess and decide then
Sure.
what we do when we do. These signs tell us to be patient, to be
Yeah.
understanding, to be persistent, and not give up.
Yeah. I'm reminded of, what I always try to do in my pre-mediation prep, and I repeat this more than once, is that things may appear to get worse before they get better. But hang in there with me. Let's work the process and let the process work. And I actually got that from, I underwent surgery a couple of years ago, and I was so appreciative of how my surgeon prepped me for not only the surgery, but what I could expect afterwards. And my surgeon told me in no uncertain terms, it may seem as though you're getting worse before you get better, but hang in there with me. Follow the regimen that I've prescribed, and we will hopefully then see the results we're looking for. And I said, that is something I'm going to transfer right from physical healing into conflict healing. And I'll tell you, it can sometimes be that little extra push they need to get past these reinforcing types of behaviors. Dr. Dupree, all of these are about mindsets and attitudes. And as our next and almost final visual will demonstrate, all of this, it really requires shifting mindsets. As a matter of fact, I happen to know that you have come to be regarded in the dispute resolution community as the mindset doc. So tell us a little bit about this shifting of mindsets that needs to occur for us to really, really engage mediated problem solving at the deepest and most productive level.
Yes. Harold, before I dive into the science, I'd like to put something out to our participants based on what the various reinforcers of impasse, because I want people to think about that so we can have a conversation at our practicum. And he mentioned a couple of times about how advocates in the mediation process want to limit the information or limit what the mediator does. And it reminded me of our analogy of triage, and you just shared your story about surgery, is that would we go into the operating room and tell the surgeon on what to do?
Right.
Because we wanted to control the process. And so I'd like our participants to think about how we might exercise greater influence and control over our process, just like a surgeon takes charge in the operating room. Okay, because that deals with shifting the mindset. And so I put this slide in here because it talks about how little things that we can do to redirect the brain, but also the parts of the brain that are involved here, much in the same way when we were talking earlier about the emotional hijack, or what Daniel Goleman used to call the amygdala hijack. And so one of the things I have, coached lawyers and mediators and medical doctors too, is, we're dealing with people under stress of some kind, and that even playing music as a nice kind of calming music when they enter your office or enter your, we don't quite have it yet in the waiting room on Zoom, but even starting off the opening meeting with some nice music in the background can redirect people. Okay. And music as a whole, from research it's shown it can change our health, our outlook, and again can redirect the neurological pathways by listening to certain kinds of music with cadence. I like to share this quote, and I can't remember who says it right now, but no one can whistle a symphony. It takes an orchestra. And that sort of goes into the next piece, then, is that the brain is working in concert here. The temporal lobe, which processes the tone and pitch, it's right in this area. And so that's when we talked about tone, volume, and inflection are such important parts of our speaking. The cerebellum regulates rhythm, timing, and process. The amygdala, we already talked about, very closely connected to the hippocampus, which is where we have the emotions and the memories. And then, of course, our own reward system. And so, again, there are small things that we can do as mediators that model a change in behavior when we redirect the emotional content that will actually influence how the brain operates, how the brain responds to all these things. We don't have to be psychologists to understand this, but just knowing that there are small behaviors, and that's some of what we're going to be teaching, can make that shift in the brain.
Excellent. Okay, well, guess what? Again, where does time fly when we're having fun? Let's go to our concluding insights on impasse. We covered a lot of ground, colleagues, and this was all essential to now what's going to take place in Module 2, where we really will get into now specific emotional interventions, and also beyond that into the analytical techniques for managing impasse. But here are some overarching concluding observations we'd ask you to at least consider. Some of you it may actually resonate with, but at least consider these. Number one, impasse is unavoidable in mediated problem solving. You know what? People say, well, I want to avoid impasse. You cannot avoid what's already occurred. They're at impasse. Let's deal with it. Through mediation, impasse will be either resolved, that's the best outcome, or it might be reduced. What if we get a partial resolution? Okay, or we may not get a resolution on outcome, but through mediation, we get a resolution on process that will lead to outcome down the road. Or that process might even be, you know what, there's one or two issues here we think we really do have to go to arbitration on because it requires a legal determination. But we resolve 4 or 5 others at mediation. So impasse will be either resolved, reduced, or reinforced, depending on several factors: the skill of the mediator, the ability of the mediator to, with insight, kind of see around the corner, as it were, what's really going on and know how to then use the appropriate interventions. We don't want to reinforce, though, impasse negatively to where it escalates the conflict. Mediation should never, ever escalate the underlying conflict between the parties. But those I would submit are the only 3 outcomes to impasse. And then very lastly, we hope you've appreciated from this foray into the very nature of impasse, deadlock, the inability to negotiate further, is that while impasse cannot be avoided in mediated problem solving, it can and it must be managed. And that's why we have titled this series Impasse Management Strategies. We manage it as we do everything else in the process. So thank you for bearing with us with that foundation. You may not see yet how it all comes together, but trust us on this. This foundation is essential for our then understanding and application of the specific techniques and tools that we hope to equip you with. Dr. Dupree, it was fun. Thank you. Lou, it was fun. Thank you. And we are now going to go off camera, and we will see you for Module 2. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We hope that you found our video very enlightening. I know that we did reference some things that you probably didn't have access to. This content is actually part of a much larger program. There are a couple of things that we want to accomplish in our remaining 15 minutes. I did reference that I was going to share with you 3 techniques, and so I'd like that opportunity to do that. But this is also an opportunity for you to raise questions and put them in the chat box so we can have a dialogue about what some of your viewpoints might be, what some of your questions might be. And Lou and I are both happy to respond, dive a little deeper, and help clarify just how we move through impasse. Lou, before I go into my techniques, some words from you.
Well, we wanted to acknowledge and apologize our colleague, Harold Coleman, because of some personal emergency, has not been able to join us. So just to note that. Dr. Dupree, I think it'd be great to address those activities and tips that you have for us, and I'm hoping that people will be free to add their questions or comments in the chat so that we can address their concerns. So let's go ahead with your tips and techniques, and hope that we can also address questions after that.
Great. Thank you. Well, since we actually recorded this information, Lou, I did actually complete a 12-part series on the 12 cognitive distortions. And they're about 2-minute videos, a little less than 3. And those are now available to all of our participants on my YouTube channel. I would like to share that. We recently published them. Maybe some of you have already seen them because we published them through LinkedIn over the last few weeks. But it would be a great opportunity because I dive in a little bit further to the 12 cognitive distortions and then also talk about how to redirect them. And so if you go to YouTube/DRD Dupree, DUPREE, then that should bring you to my channel. And if you scroll down, there's actually 4 different playlists, including Decoding the Conflict Mindset, that many of you might find interesting, my podcast series. But then there is a playlist called 12 Cognitive Distortions. Okay. Lou, I'm going to have you respond to this question after I share a couple more of my tips. The question is, how do each of you deal with one side saying, that's my last and final offer? We certainly have heard that a lot, right? But let me go back to the distortions and the emotional triggers that identified. Again, this has been through research, and so I've really dove in and been paying attention throughout the course of my own mediations and as I'm working with others in terms of what comes up. And one of the things that becomes important is to listen carefully. You now have knowledge of 12 cognitive distortions. You now know the 10 common triggers for emotional reactions. And as I said in our video, the triggers for emotional reactions usually have their foundation in some past history. And Lou's story about his sister in mediation certainly illustrated that. And so I'm going to share with you a technique that my colleague and I, Nancy Love, developed several years ago when we were teaching professionals to become mediators. And it's called the beach and the FIVMs. And so beach is a way of structuring your listening skills. So listen for what beliefs do they have about this issue? What expectations might they have for what's happening or the outcome? A actually stands for two things. What attitudes might they already have? Or what assumptions have they made about what this issue is? C is also for two words. What concerns do they have? And what challenges are they facing? And then H is for what hopes do they have? And so by using that, then that gives you something to center your attention on. Now, there are three other letters I'll share with you that go along with that as far as structuring your listening skills. And that's what I call the FIVMs. That stands for fears. And we talked about fear in the video. What fears do they have? What do they value? What's important to them? And what are some of their needs? And so again, that acronym of BEACH and FIVMs are a way to structure your listening skills in a very simple way and really hone in what people are trying to say that may not actually be saying it. And then these are where we can use our open-ended questions and clarifying statements to see where people are. Now, the one other technique I wanted to share with you is I mentioned the 3 Bs. And this is something you can actually work with your clients as well, but encourage your clients to be in the moment. What's going on for them right now? And then the second B is breathe through the moment. And again, I talked about the value of deep breathing, but you can slow down their whole internal physiology so they can get back to the prefrontal cortex. And then the last B is what I call break free from the moment and visualize. What do you want your life to look like? What do you want the world to look like if you walked out of this mediation with this problem resolved? And so it's a great way to sort of help them center in the moment and then also, get them visualizing back to the future. So those are my 3 Bs and my beach and my FIVMs. So Lou, let's go ahead and take a look at some of our questions in the chat box. So let's start off with how do each of you deal with the one side saying that's my last and final offer?
Well, thank William for that question. It's in a category of working with I call them hotheads, bullies, and difficult people. And it's a topic that really deserves a lot more time than we have. So very briefly, when you have a negotiator that starts with that, there's a variety of responses that you can consider. But before you do that, it's important to kind of keep your head. Don't get overly reactive to this. It is just a strategy, and I'm going to recommend some resources right here because we talk about this in much more length in our full training program. But there is, and you can easily find it on YouTube if you look for Max Factor III. He wrote an article recommending what he calls the 1-2 punch. And that strategy provides a list of responses. Which would include things like you could ignore the first last best strategy. You could sunshine it. You could call it out. You can come back hard as well. And then he recommends combining that with what he calls the punch two, which is a second list of strategies. But when you see that, it gives you multiple possible strategies that you could use, because it's going to depend. Not everybody who uses that tactic might respond to a certain response. So take a look at the 1-2 punch strategy from Max Factor. And the other resource I'd like to refer you to is Bill Eddy from the High Conflicts Institute. He's done a lot of study about working with people who present with difficult personalities, hardball tactics, and the like. And he came up with a strategy called ears, which where you empathize, you give the person attention, you certainly treat them with respect, but it's important that you need to set some limits. And he started out with a strategy perhaps more than a decade ago, and he's been applying it in his work as a mediator and a psychologist, and he's modified it. And recently, I think it was just within the last year, he came out with what I call version 2.0. He doesn't call it that, but I call it EARS 2.0, which challenges our training to be facilitative and attentive to emotion and history, understanding more of a person's background and concerns. And he has kind of adapted the EARS model with futurizing, and he has moved it and includes shifting the person's focus to the future, transferring and engaging parties to be more participative in setting the agenda, making the decisions, not relying on the mediator to be the process expert and the process decider. And the interesting premise that he offers is that this strategy, he feels, works not only with the hard negotiator, the my way or the highway type of person, but he also says it works for regular people. So since learning about it, I've been testing it. I've been using it, and I actually have been using it quite a bit, because we run into people that are hardcore, hard strategies, aggressive, and the like. And, I am finding that it does work, and not only with people who present with the hardball type stuff, but also regular folks. So I commend those two resources to you. There's much more we can talk about, but I want to make sure we have time to address other questions and the like.
Great. Well, Lou, thank you so much for bringing those things up, because I've read Max Factor's work, but I also have trained and worked extensively with Bill Eddy too over the years, and I've learned a great deal from him about high conflict people. And so to answer the question, the first question, and it ties into what Andrew had to say about and that we have a new question. I'm not sure we'll get to it. I apologize. But one of the things that I will do, and this starts with my opening, because if you already have it in your opening, my guidelines for the mediation, then it's easier to come back. So if someone comes back and says, "It's my last and final offer," I might go, my recall is that you both engaged or you engaged in this mediation in a good faith effort to reach resolution. And that's not really sounding like continued effort to reach resolution. And so what other proposal might you have? What other ideas? What other options do you see? Because otherwise this will close down. And I'm fairly confident that's probably not what you really want. And so what other things can you come up with? And that's actually one of Bill Eddy's techniques too, is rather than if somebody says a flat out no, well, what other proposal do you have? And that leads into William's point too, as far as sometimes our attorneys in the process can be our most challenging. And I certainly have seen that, particularly in some of the family matters I've mediated where they tend to be present. And so I'm ending up more coaching and redirecting the attorneys as much as possible, more so than the disputants in the matter. And so it is important to realize who we're dealing with, and then that's why I feel so strongly about doing pre-mediation and prepping not only the parties, but also the attorneys who are representing the parties, and getting them familiar with what I plan to do and how I plan to do it, and sort of determining just how fixed or one-sided are they. And so, again, what other proposals? You agreed in good faith. Now, I do want to address Andrew's comment or question. We only have a couple minutes left. What are techniques for dealing with the narcissist person? Quite honestly, I'd go to Bill Eddy's work, and he says it's very difficult to mediate with a narcissist. But this is where some of his, as Lou said, his version 2.0 of ears can come into play. Bill and I think Carol did a program last fall, a year ago, that talked about some of the shifts in his thinking and working with a narcissistic person. And this is where, again, we oftentimes think that we're going to, dive into the underlying interests and, get clarity about how people feel and so forth. And the narcissist, that doesn't work with the narcissist. And so I would really encourage you to look into Bill Eddy's work and become familiar with some of his newer ways of thinking about this. I know Lou and you and I just with Harold just did a program last week for the National Bar Association, and we touched on some of this content. So look for more. We've got more programs coming up, and so we're not done yet. We've got a lot more to unpack when it comes to managing impasse and getting into the psychological aspects that are techniques that everybody can use. And so we are now at our conclusion. I want to say thank you to all of our participants here today. As Lou said, unfortunately, Harold wasn't able to join us, but we do delight in hoping to cross paths with you again, and come back and see us sometime. Thank you so much.